The biggest mistake people make is believing that quiet means afraid. Those words stayed in my mind long before anyone around me understood what they really meant. My name is Ethan Brooks, and for years my parents believed I was the safest person in the family. They thought I avoided risk because I never talked about chasing impossible dreams, never bragged about ambitious plans, and never tried to convince anyone that I was destined to become the next great entrepreneur. Whenever relatives gathered for birthdays, holidays, or Sunday dinners, someone always found a reason to compare my life with someone else's. One cousin had invested in rental properties before turning 30. Another family friend had started a construction company that was growing faster than anyone expected. My older sister Emily often talked about classmates who left stable jobs to launch exciting businesses, and every conversation somehow ended with everyone wondering why I always seemed so comfortable living quietly. That Sunday evening looked no different. My mother, Linda Brooks, had spent the afternoon preparing one of her favorite family dinners. The smell of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh rolls, and homemade apple pie filled every room in the house. The television quietly played a football pregame show in the background while my father, Robert Brooks, stood near the grill on the back patio, talking with our neighbors before everyone settled around the dining table. It was the kind of evening most people would describe as ordinary, but I had learned that ordinary family dinners often produce the most unforgettable conversations. As we finished eating, Emily mentioned that one of her coworkers had recently quit a secure corporate position to open a fitness franchise. He took a huge chance, she said. Everyone thought he was crazy, but it looks like it is actually working. My father nodded with obvious approval. Sometimes you have to bet on yourself, he replied. Then he looked across the table at me. That is something your brother has never been comfortable doing. I smiled politely, but said nothing. It was easier than explaining a reality they had never asked to understand. My mother looked at me kindly before speaking. There is nothing wrong with being careful, sweetheart. Not everyone enjoys taking risks. Emily laughed softly. Ethan has always been the cautious one. Even when we were kids, he wanted to think through every decision before making it. My father leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Thinking is good, he said, but eventually you have to stop thinking and build something. You cannot spend your whole life waiting until everything feels safe. No one at that table realized how ironic those words truly were. For nearly 3 years, I had been living inside uncertainty almost every single day. I had signed contracts that could have changed my future for better or worse. I had made payroll before paying myself. I had invested every dollar I could save into something that still had no guarantee of succeeding. I had spent countless nights wondering whether I had made the biggest mistake of my life. None of those moments looked dramatic from the outside because I rarely spoke about them. My father believed risk always arrived with loud announcements and bold declarations. I had discovered that the biggest risks were often taken in complete silence. You are still working with that technology company, right? My mother asked. Yes, I answered calmly. Things are going well. My father smiled politely, although I recognized the familiar expression that followed whenever he believed I was settling for less than I could achieve. There is nothing wrong with stability, he said, but you are too talented to spend your life playing it safe. Sometimes I wonder what you could accomplish if you stopped being afraid of failure. His words were not cruel. They came from genuine concern shaped by everything he had learned during his own career. My father had worked more than 35 years for the same manufacturing company before retiring. He believed success came from consistency, loyalty, and avoiding unnecessary danger. From his perspective, risk was something reckless people chased. From mine, calculated risk was simply the price of building something worthwhile. I respected him too much to argue across the dinner table. Instead, I took another sip of iced tea and quietly listened while the conversation drifted toward other topics. Emily discussed vacation plans with her husband. My mother asked about Thanksgiving. My father joked about finally having enough time to improve his golf game. On the surface, it looked like another pleasant evening with family. Inside my pocket, however, my phone vibrated once. Then it vibrated again. I ignored it out of respect for everyone sitting around the table. A few minutes later, while my mother began serving slices of warm apple pie topped with vanilla ice cream, the phone vibrated a third time. This time I glanced down beneath the edge of the table, expecting another routine message from work. Instead, a single notification appeared across the screen. The sender was the attorney representing one of our largest investors. My heart immediately began beating faster. I carefully opened the email without changing my expression. The first sentence was all I needed to read. Wire transfer confirmed. The funding had officially arrived. After nearly 3 years of quiet sacrifice, relentless uncertainty, and decisions no one in my family even knew I had made, the company I had built from the ground up had just secured the investment that would change everything. Across the table, my father smiled while finishing his dessert, still believing his son had spent another ordinary week avoiding risk, completely unaware that the greatest gamble of my life had already begun paying off. I barely slept that night, not because I was worried anymore, but because I finally had confirmation that every sacrifice of the past 3 years had led to something real. The investment was no longer a possibility discussed during conference calls or hidden inside legal documents waiting for signatures. The money had officially arrived, and with it came a responsibility far greater than anything I had ever imagined. At 6 o'clock the following morning, I left my apartment before sunrise and drove 22 miles to the office that almost no one in my family even knew existed. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary brick building in a quiet business park outside the city. There was no giant company logo, no impressive glass entrance, and nothing that suggested dozens of people were working inside to build software used by businesses across the country. That was intentional. During our first 3 years, every dollar mattered. Fancy appearances could wait. Building a product that solved real problems could not. As I unlocked the front door, our operations manager, Olivia Bennett, was already carrying 2 cups of coffee toward the conference room. She smiled when she saw me. "Congratulations," she said. "It finally happened." I accepted the coffee and smiled back. "Now the real work begins." She laughed because she knew I meant every word. Success never arrived the moment money entered a bank account. Success was what happened after people trusted you with that money. One by one, the rest of our small leadership team arrived. There were only 12 of us who had been together since the early days, although the company now employed more than 60 people. Every person in that room remembered the months when we questioned whether we would survive another quarter. We remembered assembling desks ourselves because hiring movers was too expensive. We remembered eating inexpensive sandwiches during 12-hour workdays because ordering catered lunches felt irresponsible. We remembered celebrating every new customer because each one bought us a little more time. Looking around the room that morning, I realized none of those difficult moments felt like regrets anymore. They felt like proof that we had earned the opportunity sitting in front of us. I connected my laptop to the conference room screen and reviewed the agenda. Hiring plans, product expansion, customer support growth, security upgrades, national marketing. Every item represented another decision that could shape the future of the company. As the meeting continued, my phone vibrated quietly inside my jacket pocket. During a short break, I glanced at the screen and smiled the moment I saw my father's name. The text message contained a link to a job posting. "Excellent management position. Great benefits. Stable company. Thought you might want to look at it." I stared at the message for several seconds before placing the phone back into my pocket. He had no reason to believe I no longer needed job listings. From his perspective, he was simply trying to help his son build a secure future. I replied with the same message I had sent dozens of times over the past few years. "Thank you, Dad. I appreciate you thinking of me." A few minutes later, he answered with a thumbs-up emoji and nothing else. That was how most of our conversations about work ended. He offered advice. I thanked him. Neither of us argued. Neither of us explained very much. Back inside the meeting, we discussed plans to open a second office within 18 months if customer demand continued growing. Our head of engineering presented updates showing that client usage had increased almost 40% during the previous year. Our customer success team reported that renewal rates were exceeding expectations because businesses appreciated having real people available whenever they needed support. Listening to everyone speak filled me with quiet pride because I knew this company had never been built by one person alone. I had started it, but dozens of talented people had trusted me enough to join a dream that offered very few guarantees during the beginning. That trust mattered more than any future headline or award. Later that afternoon, I joined a video conference with our newest investor. The meeting included several advisors and one experienced entrepreneur named Daniel Morrison, who had built and sold 2 successful technology companies before deciding to invest in promising founders. After reviewing financial projections, he leaned back in his chair and looked directly into the camera. Most founders spend more time selling themselves than improving their companies, he said. Your customers seem to speak for you instead. That is unusual. I thanked him without trying to turn the compliment into a speech. He continued studying several reports before asking another question. How many people outside the company know what you have built? I smiled. Not many. He raised one eyebrow with obvious curiosity. Not even your family. I shook my head. They? No, I work in technology. They do not know much beyond that. The room grew quiet for a moment before he smiled. One day they probably will. After the meeting ended, I stood beside the conference room window watching employees leave for the evening. Some waved as they walked toward the parking lot. Others stayed behind to finish projects before heading home to their families. Every person trusted that the company would continue moving forward because of the investment we had secured. That responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders, but it also reminded me why I had stayed silent all those years. I never wanted my family celebrating a dream before it had earned the right to become reality. I wanted them to see something solid instead of hearing promises. I wanted results to speak louder than confidence. As I shut down my computer for the evening, another email appeared in my inbox. The subject line immediately caught my attention. Investor site visit confirmation. Daniel Morrison wanted to spend an entire day touring our headquarters, meeting department leaders, and evaluating our long-term expansion strategy in person. If everything went well, the partnership would become even larger than the funding we had already received. I quietly closed the laptop, took a slow breath, and realized the biggest chapter of my journey had not started with the investment. It was only beginning now. The following week moved faster than any period I could remember. Every department was preparing for Daniel Morrison's visit, not because we wanted to impress him with polished presentations, but because we wanted him to experience the company exactly as it operated every day. I gathered the leadership team early Monday morning and reminded everyone of the same principle that had guided us since the beginning. Do not perform, I told them. Just do your jobs the way you always do. If we have built something valuable, honesty will always be more convincing than perfection. Everyone agreed because that philosophy had become part of our culture long before outside investors became interested in us. We spent the next several days reviewing customer feedback, improving documentation, testing software updates, and organizing meetings with department leaders. No one stayed late simply to create appearances. Instead, people focused on solving real problems before they became larger ones. That approach had helped us earn loyal customers, and I believed it would also earn lasting partnerships. During one planning session, Olivia Bennett walked into my office carrying a folder filled with hiring reports. We have another challenge, she said with a smile that suggested the challenge was actually good news. We need more engineers than we expected. I looked through the numbers and saw that new client demand was increasing faster than our original projections. 6 months earlier, that would have terrified me. Now it reminded me why we had accepted outside investment in the first place. Growth without preparation could become just as dangerous as failure. Start interviewing immediately, I said. Find people who care about solving problems, not just writing code. She nodded because she understood exactly what I meant. Skills could be developed. Character was much harder to teach. That afternoon, I spent nearly 3 hours speaking with one of our oldest customers, a regional logistics company that had trusted us long before anyone else knew our name. The chief operating officer explained several new challenges his business was facing as shipping volumes continued increasing across multiple states. Instead of rushing to sell additional services, I filled pages of notes while asking questions about his employees, workflows, and long-term goals. By the end of the conversation, he smiled and said something I would never forget. You know why we keep renewing our contract every year? It is because you always listen before you offer solutions. After the call ended, I realized that sentence described the company far better than any marketing slogan ever could. We listened first. Everything else came afterward. Late Wednesday afternoon, my father called while I was walking between conference rooms. I answered immediately. How is your week going? He asked. Busy, I replied. We have several important meetings. That is good, he said. Warmly. Keeping busy is never a bad thing. Then he paused for a moment before continuing. I found another opportunity you might like. A friend from church knows someone hiring operations managers at a manufacturing company. Excellent retirement plan. Strong health insurance. Very stable. I smiled even though he could not see me. Thank you, Dad. I appreciate you looking out for me. He laughed softly. One of these days you are going to realize your old man gives pretty good advice. You usually do, I answered honestly. After we ended the call, I stood quietly beside the hallway window. My father was offering the best guidance he knew based on the life he had successfully lived. I never blamed him for believing stability represented the highest form of success. His experiences had taught him that lesson. Mine had simply taught me something different. Thursday morning arrived with another surprise. Daniel Morrison's office contacted us to confirm that his visit would now include 2 additional investment partners, along with a strategic advisor who specialized in scaling rapidly growing companies. The tour that had originally been scheduled for 4 people would now include 7 executives. Some members of my leadership team looked nervous when they heard the news. I understood why. More people meant more questions, greater expectations, and higher stakes. Nothing changes, I reminded everyone during our afternoon meeting. We are not preparing a performance. We are inviting people to observe what we have already built. That simple statement noticeably relaxed the room. Friday afternoon, while reviewing financial reports, I received another unexpected message. Daniel Morrison wanted to add one final event to his visit. After touring the headquarters, he requested a private strategy session with only the executive leadership team and me. According to his assistant, he wanted to discuss possibilities beyond the current investment agreement. I understood exactly what that meant. If the visit confirmed everything he expected, he was prepared to explore a much larger partnership. The opportunity was exciting, but I refused to let excitement become overconfidence. Every important milestone in my journey had come from consistent work rather than emotional celebrations. Saturday morning, I drove to my parents' house to help my father move several heavy storage boxes from the garage into the basement. We spent almost 2 hours organizing old family photographs, holiday decorations, and decades of keepsakes. While we worked, he talked about retirement, golf, neighbors, and community events. Eventually, he looked at me and smiled. I still think you worry too much, he said. Life rewards people who are willing to take chances. I picked up another box and smiled back without correcting him. If only he knew how many chances had already shaped every part of my life. Before leaving, my mother handed me a container filled with homemade cookies to take home. My father walked me to my truck and placed one hand on my shoulder. Whatever happens with your career, he said sincerely, I just want you to believe in yourself a little more than you do now. I thanked him because I understood the love hidden inside those words, even if they were built on a misunderstanding. As I drove away, my phone displayed a calendar reminder that I had created months earlier. Investor headquarters visit. Monday, 9 o'clock in the morning. I glanced once at the notification before returning my attention to the road ahead, realizing that in just a few days, 2 completely different worlds that I had carefully kept apart for years were moving one step closer to colliding. Monday morning arrived with the kind of calm that only comes after years of preparation. I pulled into the parking lot just after 7 o'clock, nearly 2 hours before Daniel Morrison and the other investors were scheduled to arrive. The building looked exactly the way it had every morning for the past 3 years. Employees slowly filled the parking spaces, carrying coffee cups, backpacks, and laptops as they greeted one another before walking through the front entrance. There were no banners welcoming investors, no expensive decorations, and no polished display created for a special occasion. I wanted our guests to see the company exactly as it functioned every other day because that was the business they were considering supporting for many years to come. Inside the office, Olivia Bennett was already reviewing the day's schedule with department managers. She handed me a printed itinerary and smiled. Everyone is ready. I looked around the room and saw confidence instead of nervousness. Engineers were discussing software updates. Customer success specialists were answering early client emails. Sales representatives were preparing for scheduled calls. Nothing felt forced because nothing needed to be. We had spent years building habits instead of performances. At exactly 9 o'clock, 3 black sport utility vehicles entered the parking lot. Daniel Morrison stepped out first, followed by 2 investment partners, a financial advisor, and 3 members of their evaluation team. After shaking hands with everyone, Daniel smiled warmly. Thank you for inviting us into your world. Thank you for coming, I replied. We are glad to show you how everything works. Rather than leading them into a conference room immediately, I guided them through the engineering department first. Software developers sat in small collaborative groups reviewing code, discussing customer requests, and solving technical challenges together. Nobody stopped working simply because visitors had arrived. Daniel quietly observed for several minutes before asking one engineer how often leadership interrupted development with unnecessary meetings. The engineer laughed. Not very often. Ethan usually tells us that our time is better spent solving customer problems than sitting through presentations. Daniel glanced toward me with an approving smile, but said nothing. We continued into customer support, where team members handled calls from businesses located across several states. One representative finished helping a client resolve an issue before introducing herself to our guests. She explained that every support request was treated as an opportunity to strengthen long-term relationships rather than simply closing another ticket. Daniel listened carefully before asking how she had learned that philosophy. She answered without hesitation, "Because that is how Ethan speaks with customers himself." Hearing those words meant more to me than any compliment directed personally toward my work. Company culture was only real when other people carried it forward naturally. The tour continued through product development, operations, finance, and marketing. Instead of presenting polished speeches, department leaders openly discussed both successes and ongoing challenges. They explained projects that had exceeded expectations as well as areas where improvements were still necessary. The investors seemed pleasantly surprised by the honesty. During lunch, Daniel looked across the table and smiled. Most founders spend all morning explaining why everything is perfect. Your people have spent the day explaining how they keep making things better. I nodded. Perfection is temporary. Improvement can continue forever. He quietly wrote something inside a notebook before changing the subject. That afternoon, we gathered inside the executive conference room for the private strategy session Daniel had requested. Large financial projections appeared on the screen, while Olivia reviewed hiring plans for the next 18 months. Our head of engineering explained the timeline for several new product features. The discussion lasted almost 2 hours before Daniel finally closed his notebook and folded his hands together. "I have one final question," he said while looking directly at me. "If additional capital were available beyond our current agreement, could this company responsibly expand nationwide within the next 3 years? The room became completely silent. Every executive turned toward me because they understood the importance of the question. I answered carefully, choosing honesty over excitement. "Yes," I said, "but only if we continue growing the same way we always have. We will never sacrifice customer trust simply to grow faster." Daniel slowly smiled. "That is exactly the answer I hoped to hear." He exchanged brief glances with the other investors before speaking again. "We would like to begin discussions about increasing our investment and becoming long-term strategic partners rather than simply financial supporters." For just a moment, the room fell completely still. Then Olivia quietly smiled. Our finance director took a slow breath. Even after months of progress, hearing those words felt almost unreal. I thanked Daniel and assured him that we would carefully review every opportunity together. The meeting ended with handshakes, genuine conversations, and plans for additional discussions over the coming weeks. As the visitors prepared to leave, Daniel paused near the front entrance. "One more thing," he said. "I hope you eventually allow more people to see what you have created. Companies like this deserve to be known." I smiled politely without giving a direct answer. After they drove away, employees gradually returned to their normal routines as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That was another reason I respected the people working beside me. They celebrated quietly and immediately focused on serving customers again. Late that afternoon, while reviewing notes from the meetings, my phone vibrated with another message from my father. He had found yet another job advertisement, this time for a senior operations position with excellent benefits and long-term stability. The message ended exactly the way many of his previous ones had. "Just something to think about. I know you like to play it safe." I stared at the screen for several seconds before smiling to myself. I replied with the same appreciation I had always shown. "Thank you, Dad. I appreciate you thinking of me." As I placed the phone back on my desk, Olivia stepped into my office carrying a folder containing preliminary partnership documents from Daniel Morrison's team. The future of the company had just become far larger than I had imagined. while the people I loved most still believed I had never been willing to take a meaningful chance. The following 2 weeks became the busiest period our company had ever experienced. Daniel Morrison's visit had opened doors that none of us could have predicted, and every department was working carefully to prepare for the opportunities ahead. New partnership discussions filled my calendar almost every day, hiring interviews continued throughout the week, and our leadership team spent hours refining expansion plans without losing sight of the customers who had trusted us from the very beginning. I reminded everyone repeatedly that growth meant nothing if we abandoned the values that had brought us this far. Every decision still began with the same simple question: would this make life better for the people who depended on our software every day? If the answer was uncertain, we slowed down until we understood the consequences. One Thursday afternoon, Olivia Bennett stepped into my office carrying a small stack of documents and an expression I had learned to recognize. Whenever she smiled that way, it usually meant another unexpected opportunity had appeared. Daniel's team just confirmed something, she said as she placed the folder on my desk. They want to host the next strategy meeting here instead of at their headquarters. They also want several potential partners to attend. I looked through the agenda and realized this would be the largest gathering of outside executives our company had ever welcomed. Representatives from several investment firms, technology partners, and business advisors would all be visiting the office together. It was another sign that people were beginning to believe in what we had quietly built over the past 3 years. Let us keep it simple, I replied. No special presentations. No unnecessary decorations. We will introduce them to the company they are actually investing in. Olivia smiled. I had a feeling you would say that. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. During the days leading up to it, every department focused on doing exactly what they always did. Engineers continued releasing software improvements. Customer success teams responded to client requests. Operations refined internal processes. There was a calm confidence throughout the building that made me proud because it reflected something much deeper than optimism. People believed in one another. On Monday evening, the night before the meeting, my mother called while I was finishing several reports. She wanted to know whether I planned to visit the family the coming weekend because my aunt and uncle were stopping by from another state. I promised I would be there if my schedule allowed it. Before ending the call, she laughed softly. Your father found another interesting job posting today. He keeps saying he is going to convince you eventually. I smiled. I know. He means well. He does, she answered warmly. He just wants you to have a secure future. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a few moments thinking about how much love could sometimes hide inside misunderstanding. My parents had always encouraged me to build a good life. They simply imagined that life differently than I did. The next morning arrived clear and bright. By 8:30, the first visitors began entering the building. Daniel Morrison greeted everyone personally before introducing me to several executives I had never met before. One of them specialized in helping rapidly growing companies expand into new markets. Another had spent decades building national partnerships between technology firms and Fortune 500 businesses. The conversations throughout the morning were thoughtful and encouraging. Instead of asking whether our company had potential, they wanted to understand how quickly we could responsibly grow without compromising quality. Around noon, Daniel pulled me aside. There is one thing I admire about this place, he said quietly. Nobody seems interested in pretending to be larger than they are. I laughed. We spent too many years trying to survive to waste energy pretending. He nodded. That honesty is becoming rare. The strategy meeting continued into the afternoon. Department leaders shared realistic forecasts instead of exaggerated promises. Financial discussions remained practical. Every projection included possible risks alongside possible rewards. By the end of the session, several executives expressed interest in supporting future expansion beyond the original investment. It was everything I had hoped for and far more than I had expected. Just as the meeting concluded, my phone buzzed inside my pocket. I glanced at the screen and saw a text from my father. Your mother and I are downtown. We finished our appointment earlier than expected. Want to grab a late lunch if you are nearby? I checked the time. I still had one final discussion with Daniel's team before the day ended, but the restaurant my parents mentioned was only a few blocks from our office. I replied that I would try to meet them if my meeting finished early. A few minutes later, my father answered, no rush. We might walk around the business district for a while. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without thinking much about it. After all, downtown covered several square miles. There was little chance they would wander anywhere near our office building. As the investors prepared to leave, Daniel suggested one final informal conversation in the executive conference room. We reviewed possible timelines for the expanded partnership and agreed to continue negotiations over the next month. When the meeting finally ended, I walked everyone toward the main entrance. Outside the large glass windows, employees were leaving for the day while others returned from late lunches carrying coffee and notebooks. I thanked each guest personally before watching the vehicles pull away from the parking lot. Just as I turned back toward the reception area, our receptionist looked through the front windows with a slightly puzzled expression. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "there is a couple outside reading the company directory. They look a little uncertain. I think they might be trying to find someone." Without giving it much thought, I walked toward the entrance, expecting another client who had arrived at the wrong building. As the automatic doors slowly opened, I immediately recognized the two familiar faces standing on the sidewalk, completely unaware that the company name displayed beside the entrance belonged to the quiet son they still believed had never taken a real chance in his life. For a brief moment, my parents simply stared at me through the glass entrance, as though they were trying to understand why I was walking out of a building they had never seen before. My father smiled first and raised one hand in greeting. "There you are," he said. "We were looking for a place to have coffee before meeting you. We wandered farther than we expected." I smiled and stepped outside to shake both of their hands before giving my mother a warm hug. "What are you two doing over here?" I asked. My father laughed. "Your mother's appointment finished early, so we decided to walk around downtown for a while. This area has changed a lot since I worked nearby years ago." He glanced toward the company directory mounted beside the entrance. "There are a lot of interesting businesses in this building." I nodded. "There are." Before I could say anything else, the front doors opened again behind me. Daniel Morrison walked outside with two of the investment partners, still discussing several points from our meeting. The moment Daniel noticed me, he smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Ethan," he said, "thank you again for everything today. We are even more excited than we were this morning." I shook his hand. "Thank you for making the trip." Daniel then looked toward my parents with a friendly expression. "Are these your parents?" "Yes," I answered. "This is my father, Robert Brooks, and my mother, Linda Brooks." Daniel immediately shook both of their hands. "It is a pleasure to meet you. You should be very proud of your son." My parents smiled politely, clearly assuming he was simply being courteous after meeting one of the employees inside the building. "Thank you," my mother replied kindly. "He works very hard." Daniel chuckled softly. "That is an understatement. We have spent the entire day learning how he built this company, and I honestly believe it has one of the strongest leadership cultures I have seen in years." Neither of my parents responded immediately. My father blinked once before looking at me, then back at Daniel. "Built this company?" he asked carefully. Daniel looked momentarily confused before answering. "Yes. Ethan founded it several years ago." A long silence followed. My father slowly turned toward the building again, his eyes moving from the company logo beside the entrance back to my face. "You mean this company?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes, Dad." Before he could ask another question, Olivia Bennett stepped outside carrying several folders that had been left in the conference room. "Ethan," she called. Daniel forgot the revised partnership documents. She stopped when she noticed my parents standing beside me. "Oh, I am sorry. I did not realize you had company." I smiled. "Olivia, I would like you to meet my parents." She immediately greeted them with a warm smile. "It is wonderful to finally meet you. Ethan talks about both of you often." My mother thanked her politely while my father remained unusually quiet. Olivia handed the folder to Daniel before continuing. "We are all excited about what comes next. The expansion plans are going to create incredible opportunities." Daniel agreed with an enthusiastic nod. "Your leadership team has built something remarkable." After another round of handshakes, the visitors finally departed, leaving the three of us standing together on the sidewalk. For several seconds, nobody spoke. My father looked toward the entrance once more before quietly asking, "When he said you built this company, what exactly did he mean?" I took a slow breath. "I started the company a little over 3 years ago." My mother's eyes widened with surprise. "Started?" she repeated softly. "From the beginning?" "Yes," I answered. "There were only 2 of us at first. We rented a very small office and spent months developing the first version of our software before we found enough customers to grow. My father looked genuinely stunned. I thought you worked for a technology company. I do, I said with a small smile. It just happens to be the one I created. My parents exchanged a long glance filled with confusion more than disbelief. My mother finally spoke. Why did you never tell us? I answered honestly. Because I wanted to build something real before talking about it. I did not want to ask people to believe in an idea that might never succeed. My father slowly shook his head as though he were trying to reorganize years of assumptions inside his mind. Every time I sent you those job listings. I know, I replied gently. I appreciated that you cared enough to keep sending them. He looked down for a moment before asking another quiet question. Were you already running this company then? I nodded. Every single time. He let out a slow breath and smiled with a mixture of amazement and embarrassment. I honestly believed you were still looking for the right opportunity. I placed one hand on his shoulder. You were trying to help me. I never saw it any other way. My mother looked through the glass entrance where employees continued walking between departments carrying laptops and notebooks. All of those people work here? She asked. Yes, I answered. There are a little more than 60 employees now. And they all work for your company? She asked again, almost whispering the words. Yes. She smiled with quiet disbelief before turning back toward me. Would it be all right if we saw it? I glanced at my watch. Most of the executive meetings had already ended, and many employees were still finishing their afternoon work. I smiled. Of course. I would love to show you around. As the automatic doors opened once more and my parents stepped inside beside me, several employees looked up from the reception area and smiled. One after another, they greeted me by name, asking brief questions about the investor meetings and tomorrow's schedule before returning to work. My father noticed every greeting, every conversation, and every expression of genuine respect. Without saying a single word, I could already see the first cracks appearing in the story he had believed about my life for so many years. As soon as we stepped through the front entrance, I realized I was seeing the office through my parents' eyes for the very first time. What had become completely ordinary to me over the past 3 years suddenly looked different because every hallway, every conference room, and every conversation represented a piece of a life I had never shared with them. Our receptionist smiled warmly. Good afternoon, Ethan. The investor team left a few minutes ago. Everything went well. It did, I replied. Thank you. She then looked toward my parents. It is wonderful to finally meet you. We have heard so many good things about both of you. My mother smiled with quiet surprise while my father simply nodded, still taking in everything around him. We walked slowly through the main hallway as employees greeted us naturally. Nobody seemed surprised to see me because this was simply another afternoon at work. One software engineer stopped briefly to ask whether I had approved the testing schedule for an upcoming release. A project manager thanked me for helping resolve a customer's concern earlier that morning. 2 new employees smiled politely as they introduced themselves before continuing toward a conference room. None of the conversations sounded rehearsed. They reflected the same daily interactions that had been taking place long before my parents walked through the front doors. Everyone knows you, my father said quietly. I smiled. We all work together every day. He looked around once more. They do not act like you are just another employee. Before I could answer, Olivia Bennett joined us from the operations department. I hope you do not mind if I steal Ethan for 5 minutes later, she said with a smile. We have one last hiring decision to review before tomorrow. Of course, I replied. She turned toward my parents. I have worked with Ethan since almost the beginning. I just wanted to tell you that your son has created a place where people genuinely enjoy coming to work. That is much harder to build than software. My mother thanked her sincerely, while my father listened without saying a word. As Olivia walked away, he quietly asked, She has been here from the beginning? Almost, I answered. She joined during our first year, when we only had a handful of employees. We continued toward the engineering department where teams were collaborating around whiteboards covered with diagrams and project timelines. One developer looked up, smiled, and said, Congratulations again on today's meetings. Everyone is excited about what comes next. Another employee added, Thank you for believing in us before anyone else did. My father glanced at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not confusion anymore. It was realization. We eventually reached the conference room where the leadership team had spent the morning with Daniel Morrison. Financial reports, planning documents, and expansion maps still covered the large display screen. My mother studied the room quietly before asking, "This is where you meet with the investors?" "Yes," I answered. "We spend a lot of time planning here." She slowly nodded. "I always imagined your work looked completely different." I smiled. Most people probably would. Just then Daniel Morrison unexpectedly returned through the front entrance. He had forgotten a notebook during the afternoon meetings and came back to retrieve it before leaving town. The moment he saw us, he walked over with the same friendly confidence he had shown throughout the day. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," I replied. "I am giving my parents their first tour." Daniel smiled warmly. "Then I should thank both of you." My parents looked at him with curiosity. "Thank us?" my mother asked. "Absolutely," Daniel replied. "Building a company like this requires character long before it requires business knowledge. I have invested in many founders over the years, and very few remain as steady under pressure as Ethan does. Your son never promises more than he can deliver, and people trust him because of that." My father looked at Daniel for a long moment before quietly asking, "When did you first meet him?" "About a year ago," Daniel answered. "We started watching the company even before discussing investments. We wanted to understand the leadership behind the business. What impressed us most was not rapid growth. It was consistency. Every customer we spoke with described the same experience. Ethan listens first, solves problems second, and never forgets that trust takes years to earn." Daniel excused himself after collecting his notebook, leaving another thoughtful silence behind. My father slowly sat down in one of the conference room chairs and looked across the empty table. "I have spent years believing I understood your career," he said quietly. "Now I realize I understood almost none of it." I sat beside him while my mother remained standing near the window overlooking the office. "I never wanted to hide anything from you," I said. "I simply wanted to wait until the company stood on its own before talking about it." My father nodded slowly. "And all those times I kept telling you to take more chances." He stopped speaking for several seconds before continuing. "You had already risked more than I ever imagined." I smiled gently. "I was afraid many times, Dad." He looked at me with genuine surprise. "You were?" "Of course," I answered honestly. "There were months when I did not know if we would have enough customers. There were nights when I questioned every decision I had made. Taking risks does not mean you stop feeling fear. It means you keep moving forward even when fear is sitting beside you." He lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly saying, "I always believed courage looked loud. I thought brave people announced their dreams and chased them without hesitation." I shook my head. Sometimes courage is very quiet. Sometimes it is simply showing up again tomorrow and doing the work no one else can see. My father leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "Then I owe you an apology." I immediately shook my head. "You never owed me anything. You were trying to protect me." He smiled sadly. "Maybe, but I also underestimated you for a very long time." My mother walked over and gently placed one hand on my shoulder. "We are proud of what you built," she said softly. "But today I think I am even more proud of the person you became while building it." Hearing those words meant more to me than every investment agreement signed that afternoon, because for the first time my parents were no longer seeing the quiet son they believed had settled for safety. They were finally seeing the years of unseen determination that had always been there. The tour lasted nearly another hour, but by the time we returned to the lobby, it felt as though years of misunderstanding had quietly disappeared without anyone raising their voice. My parents thanked several employees before we walked outside together. The afternoon sun had begun to settle lower across the downtown skyline, and instead of heading home immediately, my father suggested we finally have the late lunch that had originally brought them into the neighborhood. We found a small family-owned restaurant a few blocks away, and for the first time in a very long while, nobody talked about what I should do with my career. Instead, they wanted to understand the career I already had. After we ordered our meals, my father folded his hands together on the table and looked at me with the same thoughtful expression he had worn since leaving the office. "I have been thinking about something," he said quietly. "Every time I sent you another job listing, you never once told me to stop." I smiled. "Because I knew why you were sending them." He slowly nodded. "I thought I was encouraging you to believe in yourself. I never realized you had already believed in yourself enough to build an entire company." I shook my head gently. Believing in myself did not mean I always felt confident. There were plenty of mornings when I wondered whether I had made the wrong decision. There were weeks when I questioned whether we would find enough customers to keep everyone employed. Confidence came and went. Commitment stayed. My mother listened carefully before asking, "Did you ever think about giving up?" I answered honestly because there was no reason to hide the difficult parts anymore. More than once. During our first year, I came very close to accepting another job. It would have been easier. It would have been safer. But every time I looked at what we were building and the people who had trusted me enough to join the company, I knew I had to keep going one more day. My father slowly smiled. "That sounds much riskier than anything I imagined." We laughed together, and for the first time the laughter carried no awkwardness. It simply felt like a family learning something new about one another. After lunch, we walked back toward the parking lot where my parents had left their car. Before getting inside, my father reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "This is almost embarrassing now," he admitted with a quiet grin. I unfolded it and immediately recognized another employment advertisement. Drive away. I noticed my father glance back toward the office building one more time before turning onto the main road. Something had changed inside him, and I knew it had nothing to do with money or business success. He had simply discovered that courage could look very different from what he had always imagined. Over the next several weeks, our relationship settled into a new rhythm. My father still called regularly, but the conversations gradually changed. Instead of asking whether I had considered applying for another position, he started asking how the expansion plans were progressing. He wanted to know how many people worked at the company now, what new challenges we were facing, and how the software actually helped customers. If he did not understand something, he admitted it openly instead of pretending he already knew the answer. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. One Saturday afternoon, I visited my parents for another family dinner. Emily was there with her husband, and before long the conversation naturally turned toward work. My father surprised everyone by smiling at me before speaking. "Your brother taught me something recently," he said. Emily looked curious. "What was that?" My father leaned back in his chair. "I spent years believing that taking risks meant making loud decisions that everyone could see. It turns out the biggest risks sometimes happen quietly while nobody is paying attention." Emily looked at me with obvious surprise. "Wait, Mom told me you started your own company, but I thought she was exaggerating." I laughed softly. She was not. My father proudly explained everything he had learned during the office tour. He described the employees, the investors, the leadership team, and the respect people showed every day. I noticed that he never exaggerated anything. He simply told the truth, and somehow the truth sounded more meaningful than any dramatic story ever could. Later that evening, after everyone had finished dessert, my father walked with me to my truck, just as he had done so many times over the years. This time, however, the conversation felt completely different. "You know," he said while placing one hand on the side of the truck, "I always thought my responsibility as a father was protecting you from unnecessary risks." I nodded. "I know." He smiled warmly. "Now I think my responsibility is trusting the man you became." Those words stayed with me throughout the drive home because they represented something far more valuable than approval. They represented understanding. My parents had not changed because they suddenly admired business success or investment agreements. They had changed because they finally saw the years of discipline, patience, responsibility, and quiet determination that had always existed behind the life they never fully understood. Father explained that they wanted someone who had built a business to share practical advice instead of motivational slogans. I gladly accepted. When I arrived, nearly 50 students filled the meeting room, along with several teachers, parents, and community volunteers. My father welcomed everyone before introducing me. As he stood behind the podium, I noticed him pause for a brief moment as though choosing his words carefully. Then he smiled. "For many years," he said, "I believed I understood what courage looked like. I thought courage meant never being afraid. I thought success followed people who looked confident every single day. My son taught me something much more important. Real courage often belongs to people who quietly keep working even while they are uncertain. Sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one who does not feel fearless but keeps moving forward anyway." I listened silently from the front row, realizing those words meant more because they came from him rather than from me. After he finished speaking, he invited me to share my experiences. Instead of talking about investments or company growth, I told the students about patience, responsibility, listening carefully, treating people with respect, and understanding that meaningful careers are usually built one ordinary day at a time rather than through dramatic moments. Several students stayed afterward to ask thoughtful questions about starting businesses, choosing careers, and handling uncertainty. My father stood nearby during every conversation with a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. As we packed away chairs after the event, one volunteer approached my father and complimented him on raising such a grounded son. I watched my father smile before answering in a way I never expected. "The truth is," he said, "I spent years trying to teach him about courage. In the end, he was the one who taught me." Hearing those words filled me with gratitude because they reflected genuine humility rather than pride. A few weeks later, my parents visited the office again, this time by invitation instead of coincidence. The atmosphere felt completely different from their first visit. Employees greeted them by name, several department leaders stopped to chat for a few minutes, and my mother laughed as she recognized familiar faces from the previous year. My father wandered slowly through the engineering department before stopping beside a large whiteboard covered with project schedules. "I remember standing here the first time," he said quietly. "Back then I was trying to understand what you had built. Today I am simply enjoying watching it continue to grow." Before they left, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed me a neatly folded envelope. Inside was the final printed job advertisement he had ever saved for me, the one he had nearly given me on the day everything changed. Across the top, he had written a short note in blue ink. "I kept searching for the right opportunity because I did not realize you had already created it." I smiled, folded the paper carefully, and placed it back inside the envelope. "I am going to keep this," I told him. He looked surprised. "Really?" I nodded. "Because it reminds me that love sometimes arrives disguised as misunderstanding. You never sent these because you doubted me. You sent them because you wanted the best future you could imagine for me." He smiled warmly. "Now I know your future was always bigger than the one I imagined." As I watched my parents drive away that afternoon, I realized success had never been about proving anyone wrong. If I had spent those years trying to win arguments or convince my family that they misunderstood me, none of us would have grown. Instead, I had chosen to let time, consistent effort, and honest work tell the story for me. Looking back, I no longer remembered the difficult conversations with disappointment. I remembered them with gratitude because they made our eventual understanding even more meaningful. Every family carries assumptions that can quietly shape relationships for years, but assumptions do not have to become permanent. Sometimes all they need is patience, humility, and the willingness to see someone as they truly are instead of who we imagine them to be. My father once believed I avoided risk because I lived quietly. Today he understood. That silence had never been the absence of courage. It had simply been the place where determination was growing strong enough to build something worth believing in. And in the end, the greatest thing either of us built was not a company, but a deeper respect for one another that would last far longer than any business success ever could.